It's my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Chaim Rosenberg. Many of us recall that Chaim spoke at our Tuesday Club on his book, American Jewish Servicemen. Just as a show of hands, how many of us heard that program? Yes, I see a sprinkling of hands, which also means we've got a lot of new people here, which is wonderful. His new work, and the subject of today's talk, is Children of the American Jewish Ghetto. About a show of hands here, how many here can look back and say that someone from their family was in the Jewish ghetto? I see some hands here too, Dr. Chaim. Chaim was born in South Africa, lived in Tel Aviv, London, and Sydney before settling a half-century ago in the United States. Chaim grew up in a Yiddish-speaking home, but was educated in English from elementary school through graduate school, earning degrees in medicine and a PhD. After a gratifying career in psychiatry, where he was affiliated with Harvard and Boston University medical schools, he turned to the study of American history, writing 15 books focused largely on the role of the individual in shaping American greatness. Chaim now makes Chicago his home. Please welcome, and please join me in welcoming back to our Tuesday Club, Dr. Chaim Rosenberg.
Okay, it's nice to be back. Thank you very, very much for inviting me. Thank you, Ron. Immigrants are very much in the news these days, and the question is whether they are good for the country or bad for the country. And I'm going to talk today about one immigrant group that arrived mostly in the United States after 1881 until about World War I. Now, the Jewish immigration came largely from Eastern Europe, from what is called the Pale of Settlements in Russia. And over the course of 30 or 40 years, about 2.5 million people arrived in the United States. And the book I wrote is about how the children of these immigrants adjusted to life in the United States and have been, of course, here for the last 150 years, and how they've succeeded or failed in making their place in the United States. So the book is called The Children of the American Jewish Ghetto. At the close of the 19th century, the ghettos were immigrants, white immigrants, mainly Jewish, who landed up in the Lower East Side of New York, around Maxwell Street in Chicago, and in the ghettos of Boston, Philadelphia, and other cities. And the question is, how do they make it? Now, at that time, around 1881, when the immigrants were first coming, the people who lived here looked down upon them, regarded them as being inferior and physically unfit, and thought they were a degenerate group and would bring down the value of the American citizenship. And we hear these topics even in our day. So I'm going to discuss this one particular group. There were other groups, the Italians, the Irish, and the Scandinavians, who have their own stories, but I'm going to focus on the Jewish history. So this is the cover of the book, and incidentally, I brought some copies of the book today, and if you'd like a copy of the book, I'd be happy to sell them at $20 a copy. Thank you. So this is the story of the immigration, and this is a picture of a newspaper story about Roosevelt admonishing the Tsar of Russia around 1880 for persecuting the Jews. And this shows this aged Jew coming up with all the burdens of immigration and coming to the United States. Now, in the course, as I said, of the 40 years, about 2.5 million Jews arrived from Eastern Europe. They came by ship. They came mainly from Hamburg and got on the steamers and came to New York. And this is a picture done around 1880 of a shipload of immigrants arriving and seeing the Statue of Liberty and seeing the potential of a brave new world for themselves. And here's a picture taken around 1900 of a young Jewish immigrant looking very old worldy with her scarf around her head and looking apprehensive about what future she had in the United States. About 90% of the Jewish immigration came to New York, and there was a source of great anxiety to the existing Jewish community, mainly of German Jewish origin, who feared that it would give rise to anti-Semitism. So there was an effort to divert some of these Jews to other places, including Galveston. And this is a picture around 1906 of a shipload of Jews diverted from New York and arrived in Galveston. And many of the Jews who landed up in the lower part of the country came through Galveston and Texas and then moved up north. This is a picture of the Jewish ghetto in Chicago around Maxwell Street. I don't know if some of you know the history of Maxwell Street, but around 1881, for the next 20 or 30 years, there was a thriving Jewish ghetto with about 50,000 people. They weren't always the same people, because people who were beginning to succeed moved out of the ghetto and new immigrants moved in to take their place. And most of them found work in tailoring and in the clothing industry. So how do they arrived by ship to New York, and some of them began to gravitate to other parts of the country. In this case, about 200,000 or 300,000 of these immigrants landed up in Chicago, and they created around Maxwell Street a kind of a Eastern European ghetto with all these shops and all these street vendors selling all kinds of goods along the streets of Maxwell Street and other streets. This is a picture of one of the great sons of Eastern Europe, Shalom Aleichem, who wrote many books describing Jewish life in Eastern Europe. And he spent the last years of his life in the United States. He died in 1916. There was a great funeral for him in New York. And this picture shows the tens of thousands of people who came out in the streets to celebrate the funeral or to commemorate the funeral of Shalom Aleichem. Now, turning now to the great ghetto, which was in New York City. It was on the Lower East Side of New York City, and at any one time there were as many as 450 to 500,000 Jews living there. There were also other immigrants, Italians and others, living in very cramped corners, living in these 4 or 5 story tenements, walk-up tenements, and people who owned the tenements sublet them to other immigrants. And so oftentimes there were dozens of people living in any apartment with the washrooms outside, so they had to go downstairs to go to the washrooms. And here again, if you look at the street level, were the street vendors selling all kinds of goods for people who needed their fruit and vegetables to buy. One of the great sons one of the great children of the Jewish ghetto was, of course, Irving Berlin, who was born in 1888 and lived over 100 years. And Irving Berlin grew up in Tsarist Russia. He came to the United States around age 4. His father was a shochet, which is a Jewish ritual slaughterer for chickens and for other animals, and his father earned a very meager living. Irving, whose name was Isidore Israel Berlin, grew up in this environment, and he had, for some magical reason, this incredible talent for music. He could not write music, but he could not read music, but he certainly could play it very well. He wrote some of the great songs of America in the course of his lifetime. He produced about 1,500 songs, amongst which were, of course, Blue Moon, White Christmas. Imagine a Jewish boy writing White Christmas. And his great song, of course, was God Bless America. He wrote that song for the First World War, but he wrote it in a musical that he thought the song didn't fit the musical, so he left it out and kept it in the drawer. But came the Second World War, and Kate Smith asked him whether he had a good song, and he took out the song called God Bless America. And his daughter said the song commemorated his great love of America and the fact that he was taken in as a young Jewish immigrant boy. And here he is during World War II with Kate Smith. Another picture of Irving Berlin shows him entertaining the troops in 1944 on one of the great ships of the United States Navy. Now, how do they grow up in the ghetto? In the next few slides I want to show you, these were taken around 1900 to 1910, and they're taken of kids working on the streets of the great cities of America. And this is a young Jewish boy called Hyman selling newspapers. He was aged about 4 or 5 on the streets of Lawrence, Massachusetts, which was then a great textile city. Another picture shows 3 Jewish girls selling newspapers in Hartford, Connecticut. These pictures were taken by a fellow called Louis Heim, who took many pictures of kids on the streets of America selling newspapers, shining shoes, and other tasks. And here are 3 Jewish girls selling newspapers. Another Jewish boy selling newspapers in Burlington, Vermont around 1909. And he has another Jewish boy selling newspapers in Washington, D.C. Around 1908. And why do they do this? Because they were helping the families to make a living. The families were struggling tremendously, and the kids were sent out to work. Now, what became of them? So I'm trying to give a picture of how they went from living in the ghetto to trying to help the family to make ends meet, and then going out into the great world of American life. This one I like particularly. It's a newsboy, 2 newsboys in Knoxville, Tennessee, around 1910. It shows the old cars. And what would often happen is an older boy of about 10 would get a 6-year-old or 7-year-old to assist him to sell newspapers, because people had more sympathy for smaller children. So you see the larger boy on the right, and with his young associate or assistant selling newspapers. Now, the reason why these pictures were taken is because some people believed that these kids were staying out of school and were missing school and would become delinquents. But the purpose of this talk to show that, so of course, some did become delinquents, but many of them became quite distinguished Americans. Here's another boy, Samuel Weinstein, who's a messenger boy, another one of the skills that kids did in those days. And he was working as a messenger boy for a telegraph company in New Bedford, Massachusetts. An interesting picture of the child labor in the mills, in the textile mills of Massachusetts. There's a group of boys, mostly Irish, some Scandinavian, and this Jewish boy in the middle with these overalls on, and they were working. They were boys of 9, 10, 11, 12, who had maybe finished elementary school, and from that time on were working in the mills as mill workers. How do the parents make a living? Overwhelmingly, the Jewish parents worked in the shmata trade, which is the textile industry, working in these sweatshops. Now, this is a picture of a sweatshop in Chicago, showing a dozen or more people working in the small room with minimal heat and working and sewing clothes. And the clothes were subcontracted and then were sold to larger manufacturers. One of the great episodes in the textile trade was the funeral of the Triangle Fire around 1910, where about 130 people, mostly Jewish workers, were burned to death in this building, where the doors were shut, and the workers could not escape. Some jumped out of the window and died. Others were died in the fire. And there was a celebration, or not celebration, there was a commemoration in New York City to commemorate their deaths. And this is this wonderful picture showing the funeral of the Triangle Fire. One of the great successes, I would say, of the textile workers were that some of them became leaders of the textile workers unions, because there was largely a Jewish profession at that time. So the picture shows David Dubinsky. He was a great pointer, and he was here with Sidney Hillman in the middle. These guys were the leaders of the textile workers union across America, and began to build up the work of the textile unions, including providing health care and pensions for workers. Here in Chicago, what would become of these kids? There was a great fear that they would follow their parents into the textile industry. So the German Jewish elite, who had come before the Eastern European Jews, set up this trade school in Chicago. I don't know if the building still exists, but this is a building where Jewish boys could learn plumbing, carpentry, and other trades in the hope that they would diversify away from the textile industry. In New York City, there was the Educational Institute, which exists to this day. It was a large educational institute teaching all kinds of trades and all kinds of sports, including boxing. Now, these Jewish guys were artists and academics. Some of them were downright crooks. And this is the famous Bugsy Siegel, who met an inglorious end in his 40s when he was shot to death somewhere in Hollywood. Another notorious Jewish gangster was Meyer Lansky, a very smart, dapper fellow who was apparently the bookkeeper of the gang, of the mob. But some of them were great successes. The picture shows Golda Meir on the left. She grew up in Milwaukee, then went to Colorado, and then in her mid-20s went to Israel, where she joined the government and became a leader of the Israeli government and was appointed prime minister. And yes, she's seen with Nixon and with Kissinger, and she was one of the great leaders of Israel, coming originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What I found surprising about these immigrants is how many of them gravitated into the sports. I think one tends to think of Jews as being successful in the arts and the sciences and academia, but the many of them became professional boxers. About 36,000 of them became professional boxers. They led their trade in the sports arena around the various cities. And this is a boxer who grew up in Chicago. He was a world champion in the featherweight division. Another one was Abe Attell. There were many of them. I've just taken a picture of a few, and these pictures are available online, so I've taken them. One of the more famous one was Joe Cheminsky, here seen with Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion of the world, and these two guys had a battle around 1900. I think that battle Cheminsky won. He came from San Francisco. Jack Johnson, I think, was famous because he married a white woman and had a great deal of difficulty because he was accused of transporting white woman across state lines, but he became the world champion boxer. One of the great Jewish boxers was Benny Leonard, who grew up in the Lower East Side slums of the Jewish slums of New York. He's seen here on the left, and he was one of the great welterweight boxers of his time. Now, this is Damon Runyon. I'm just going to have a sip of water. Damon Runyon was a newspaper reporter, mainly sports, but he's also famous for writing stories about New York, including Guys and Dolls, which was a great movie, I think. But he wrote articles about boxers, and he noticed that he said this was after World War I, when many Jews were being accused of being lazy, of being weaklings, of getting cushy jobs, and in a sense opting out of their military duty. And Damon Runyon wrote an interesting article around 1929 applauding the Jewish boxers, saying how many of them had become world champion, and in a sense saying that Jews were not weaklings, but they were commendable in the sports. Amongst them was Barney Ross. Now, Barney Ross grew up in New York, but he lived most of his early life in the Maxwell Street ghetto. He was his father was a Hebraic scholar who became a shopkeeper. His father was killed in a robbery when Barney Ross was around age 14. Barney became pretty much of a delinquent, was hanging around the mob in Chicago. And then one day he was told to get a job and to straighten out. And he went to a gym, and he was shown to have great skill as a boxer. He became a world champion welterweight boxer and lived in Chicago. And eventually his other great fame was that he was in World War II. He was a hero in the Pacific and saved the lives of several of his fellow soldiers. And he died in Chicago of a cancer of the throat. Another great Jewish sportsman was Hank Greenberg, shown on the far right, the tall guy, one of the great batsmen of his time. Here is Meyer Prinstein, who was an Olympic long jump and triple jump champion, competing in the St. Louis Olympic Games of 1904. And here's another great Jewish sportsman, Abe Kiewit, who was an Olympic winner around 1930. Copeland was, in her time, the most skilled and competent Jewish or general woman athlete. She was skilled in throwing the javelin as well as discus throwing. The next great activity amongst some Jewish people, of course, was in music. This is George Gershwin, who grew up in the Lower East Side, and for some magical reason, in his teens, began to play the piano, and he began conducting music, including Porgy and Bess and other great quintessential American musicals. Another, of course, is Aaron Copland, whose Appalachian Spring, I think, is one of the most quintessential American tunes. He grew up also in New York City and devoted his life to music. A third one, of course, is Leonard Bernstein, Candide, and West Side Story. And I think these musicians sort of understood maybe the essence of American music, and to this day, their music is played. Also in the arts, of course, is Arthur Miller, the great playwright. Another, Saul Bellow, who lived most of his life in Chicago. Saul Bellow won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And coming to the sort of the popular music, George Burns, whose real name was Nathan Birnbaum. I remember reading the story of his early life. He grew up in the Lower East Side, and he formed, when he was about 4 or 5, a quartet with him and his buddies, and they were recognized by some expert, and they were then put on a career that lasted the rest of his life as an entertainer. At this time, I'd like to say that they were, of course, we all know Walter Matthau and the Odd Couple, but Walter Matthau grew up in the Yiddish theater. He was the other great actors of the Yiddish theater was Edward G. Robinson and Paul Mooney. I was watching the other day on Criterion Channel the Little Caesar, and I belonged to a chain gang, and these were the artists who came out of the Yiddish theater and then got into the American mainstream theater and were very prominent in the 1930s and 40s. Academics. One of the great academics of his time was Milton Friedman, who was at the University of Chicago. He won the Nobel Prize in economics. Another was Paul Samuelson, who grew up in Gary, Indiana, and was a professor at MIT and got the Nobel Prize in economics as well. And Julius Axelrod, who was a scientist who couldn't get into an American medical school, but he made some great discoveries and won the Nobel Prize in medicine. The story of polio. When I was a boy, when we were children, polio was the great feared illness. I remember wearing a camphor container to protect me from it. My mother thought that might help. But of course, it was a terrible virus that paralyzed many children. So people were terrified of getting polio. There were 2 scientists working in New York trying to find a prevention. The one was Jonas Salk, who came up with the intramuscular injection of the vaccine against polio. The other was Albert Sabin, who came up with the oral vaccine. And these 2 people changed the whole fear of this dreaded disease and protected people to our day. So nowadays, there are very few cases of polio due to these 2 Jewish scientists. Admiral Hyman Rickover. His real name was Chaim Gedalia Rickover. He grew up in the slums of Maxwell Street. He was sold newspapers as a boy, helped his parents to make ends meet, and he, by some luck of the draw, went to the United States Naval Academy, and then went on to this incredible career as the founder of the American atomic submarine. He changed his religion and became an Episcopalian, but he was born, as I said, Chaim Gedalia Rickover. I'll end by a discussion of World War I. This wonderful picture was a poster presented by the Jewish Welfare Board, shows an old-time Jewish grandfather or grandfather worrying about his children, but inside the hut are all these Jewish guys having a wonderful time being welcomed by the United States Army in World War I. And for those who can read Yiddish, it says that the Army has given them a home. Another poster shows this Jewish guy going off to fight, carrying his books. He's carrying his Torah under his arm and his violin as well, and off he goes to battle. But it's also presented by the Jewish Welfare League, and it is to show that the army is taking care of these people. And finally, I think this is finally, is a picture of the 77th Division in France. Now, the 77th Division was a New York division, and about a third or half of its members were Jewish. And this picture shows the army distributing matzah on Passover, I think 1919, and these huge stacks of matzah in the background, and these guys were busy distributing the matzah for the troops in Europe. So, in conclusion, this is a picture of one immigrant community that I think has sunk its roots into America and has found a home in this country over the last century and a half. Now, the whole immigration ended around 1924 with the Reed-Johnson Act. The act indicated that immigrants were a deterrent to the United States and were bringing down the moral character of America. So Reed and Johnson, two congressmen, helped pass the act, and they ended the immigration of Eastern European Jews, as well as Italians, as well as Japanese people and Chinese. And I think this has all changed. And I will conclude by saying that I think that immigration has been the godsend of America and has given vitality as displayed by the Jewish group that came here between 1881 and 1914. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'll wait to answer questions. Okay, Donna, can you come and help?
We have a microphone. We'll wait for the mic and then we can have people.
Hello. Can you tell us why people were categorized as Jewish as opposed to Russian, Polish, Romanian, when they come from different countries?
I've asked my wife to come up and help me because I don't hear too well. Okay.
Why were they considered to be Jewish rather than from the country there?
Oh, well, the answer, as I said, most of them came from the Pale of Settlements, and in a sense, they were discriminated by the Russians and kept separate from the main Russian life, and grew up in an area which is now partly Poland and Ukraine. And there was tremendous pressure because the population was growing and they weren't allowed to leave that area. So in a sense, they felt themselves more Jewish than Russian because the Russian government regarded them as being outsiders and kept them isolated from the mainstream of Russian life.
In the United States.
How did who count them?
What did you count?
How did they come? Well, how did they come here? Well, around the close of the 19th century, there were some large shipping lines that had steerage, and they came on steerage, which meant that they were at the bottom of the ship, crowded together and paying about $10 to come from Europe to the United States. So it was fairly cheap, and they could borrow the money or make the money for the journey. But most of them arrived pretty poor.
Yes, a wonderful presentation. My father came to this country. His mother put him on a boat. He was born in Lithuania. Yes, he didn't swim. In 1911, he was when he was 14 years old. He was met by an uncle who was already here, and he skipped Ellis Island, and it was terrific to have somebody meet a young boy. Fast forward, my dad ended up in a small town in Greenville, Michigan, with his brother who came after him. They started a haberdashery, then they had a furniture store, and then ultimately, you remember the 1945 World Series? between the Chicago Cubs and the Detroit Tigers. My dad was a big fan of Hank Greenberg. And Hank Greenberg, who you saw there, served in the Army. And luckily for Detroit, he came home, Hank Greenberg did, just before Labor Day in 1945. And there was a Labor Day doubleheader in Detroit. Now, we lived about 60 miles from Detroit in this small town. And my dad, he hardly ever went to any sporting event, but he wanted to see Hank Greenberg. So he drove, there were 3 boys now, drove to Detroit, got tickets, standing room for the doubleheader. We stood there for both games at one price. Hank Greenberg hit a couple of home runs. And after that, what happened? Detroit won their part of the World Series and beat the Cubs in 7 games. I'm sure a lot of you remember that exciting time.
I just have a question.
Stand up, too. You gotta give me the microphone so I can.
Well, 2 things. Number one, weren't many of those immigrants sponsored when they came here, which is different than what it used to, what today? I mean, I heard that a lot of them were sponsored. And also, as relative of many of those immigrants, as I am, we're supposed to not feel, we're not supposed to feel anything negative about the immigration system today. But there is a difference. Can you kind of go through how things are different today in terms of the immigrant situation as opposed to what we did, what our relatives went through when they came here?
He's wanting you to differentiate between immigration today as opposed to the immigration when in the.
I would say my quick answer is that when the Jewish immigrants came and the Italian immigrants came, there was a tremendous backlash by some people who said that they were physically, intellectually inferior and that they were degrading America. This goes back 120 years or more. And I'm hearing the same comments now about the new immigrant groups. So I would say that over my 60 years in America, I've seen immigrants who've arrived from South America who make it and who succeed in America in the same way that the Italians, the Irish, and the Jews did 100 years ago. So my sense is that there are some people who oppose immigration under all circumstances, but the immigrants, if given the chance, succeed in America overwhelmingly then and now.
I want to add, we want to give you a hand on that, but I want to add on to that question, this thought. The word ghetto is in your book. You brought some books here, and I know that people are going to look at that. The word ghetto has a negative connotation. It comes out as poor, and maybe that's what makes it negative. It doesn't have to be negative, and that's the point of my question. Are there advantages that these people had because of the tough life that they had to struggle more? They didn't have the internet. They didn't have quick answers to everything via this little device. They didn't have artificial intelligence. They had their own. Are we missing something today that they had that created a spirit of more success, whether it would be in medicine, education, or crime in the case of Bugsy, etc.? So, I mean, how do you feel about what the people that had the toughness to go through that had as a plus, as opposed to how much we give our kids today. And they're the best kids money can buy up on the North Shore. How do you feel about that?
Essentially, was the hardship that people experienced made them more successful and
You know, I sometimes feel that way. I mean, I was having a discussion when I first came here about how people who are given things get lazy, and that hardship sometimes gives you a good backbone and encourage you. But I think, including hardship, I think the people have to have a sense that they can achieve something and that the greater society will allow them an opportunity. So I think it's a combination of an inner drive and the opportunity. Now, the reason why the Jews left Russia is because there was no opportunity. The reason why they came to America is because there was opportunity. So I think it's a combination of your own drive to want to make something of yourself, as well as the opportunity given to you to do that. So I would say, in my biased opinion, that these opportunities exist as much now as they did 100 years ago, even more so. But that maybe if people are given too many benefits, they take advantage of what the government gives them and don't depend enough on themselves. So I think you have to want to do it for yourself, as well as be given the chance to do it.
By the way, we have 48 people on Zoom as well, in addition to the large group we have here. I'm going to check for Zoom questions.
There's another question.
Well, I have a couple of comments. I'm a second generation. I was born in Scotland, but raised in Newark, New Jersey. So I want to put in a word for Newark, New Jersey, because we had our own area that's similar to the Lower East Side. It's called Prince Street. All my grandparents were in Newark, New Jersey. I basically grew up in Philip Roth country, went to the same school. He was 1 year behind me. But getting back to why my four grandparents came to this country during the same interval that you're mentioning is because of pogroms. I don't think it was so much opportunity, it was pogroms. And they tracing it all back to where this happened. When I was an intern at Michael Reeves Hospital, this is a long time ago, an old Jew who was a patient, if you asked him where he was from, Russia, Poland, it was all the same. But that's why they left, was because of the pogroms and the massacres. But in any case, in North New Jersey, where there was fairly rapid social escalation, my early childhood, after coming from Scotland, was with my grandparents who spoke Yiddish, and who also, like I say, it was a self-selected, I don't want to use the word ghetto, but this is where all the Jews settled in Newark. And then thereafter, so I'm second generation. My first generation was my father, who became a psychiatrist, who studied medicine in Scotland, which is why I was born there. But in any case, I think the upward mobility was more in terms of now having the opportunity to go to school or whatever. Although, as it turns out, there was a quota for Jews in medical school, which is why my father studied medicine there, and that's why I was born there. I think that's the comments.
Is that a question? Or?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Question or comment?
You know, I think, as I said, oh, one more. Okay, how about one more?
Yeah. My father was grew up in the Jewish ghetto in Boston, South Boston, and as the youngest of 4 children. But I'm curious about when the family moved to Milwaukee eventually, and there and in other places, there was a lot of discrimination by the German Jews who had come before them. And I wonder if you would comment on that, because they were held down by the older establishment Jews who didn't want these poor peasants to come into ruin their lives.
The German Jews, or Germans in general, emigrated to the United States around 1848, when there were a series of revolutions in Central Europe, and they came to escape from the turmoil in Europe. And about 150,000 German Jews came at that time, and they came. They were poor, and many of them traveled around the country selling goods. From that, they developed small shops, and from the small shops, they developed department stores. And some of the great department stores, Bloomingdale's, Neiman Marcus, these were German Jews who founded these great department stores, and were all over the country, including in Chicago. Now, when the Russian Jews arrived around 1881 and onwards, the German Jews had become pretty acclimated to American life and were frankly embarrassed and by the outlandish appearance of the Russian Jews with the scarves on their head. The men wore beards, they wore side curls in their hair, were praying all the time, and spoke this outlandish language called Yiddish. So the German Jews tried their best to get these Jews elsewhere, so that, like the story I told about Galveston, to get them distributed elsewhere, or to train them in the sciences. And the Educational Alliance in New York was founded by German Jews. The trade school in Chicago was founded by German Jews. But these were part of the accommodation of the new group. After a while, the German Jews receded in importance, and the Russian Jews became more prominent in the leadership of Jewish community. So I would say nowadays probably 80% of Jews in America are people of Eastern European, Russian background, not German background. And I think every existing group that establishes itself, I think there's a golden rule that says, let me in, but then close the door, you know. And I've seen this in England, I've seen this in America, is that I'm okay because I'm special, but the other people keep them out. So I think we all, in a sense, want to shut the door and to denigrate people who come after us and to call them inferior. And I think this has been the pattern for the last 100 years or more.
Doctor, we have a question from Zoom. Before I ask the question from Zoom,
Yeah.
I want to give microphone training to our group. This doesn't work.
So
This doesn't work. This works. This is not how you can hold this particular microphone. It's a cheap microphone because they spend a lot of money helping people with social. So they spend a lot of money. You see what I'm saying? You can't be heard. And when you can't be heard. This really becomes a problem. Well, you don't need to put it on your chin, but does that better? Okay, well then put it on your chin. I'm learning from our group. Right. Now the question from Zoom is this. Marlene is saying, we think you missed the women in Chicago. Do you have anything to say about the women in Chicago from
The woman in Chicago.
women? Oh, well, yeah, women in Chicago, I think, well, many of them worked in the in the schmutter trade, in the clothing industry, and they were, and one of the great unions was the women's International Women's Trade Union that Dubinsky was the chairman of. So the women were very important, and some of the early strike leaders were women. I've got their names in the book. I can't recall their names offhand. So, but it's in the book. So I would like to, can I conclude?
Well, Bob has a question, and then,
The lady wants to say,
is there another question?
there is.
I was going to give it to Bob.
There is another question. Excuse me. There's another question. That lady over there has something to.
Okay, well, Bob, you'll get the last one, but we'll get to one question here
Yes. Yes.
on your chin.
Actually, it's not a question, but Emma Goldman was in Chicago. She's buried in Waldheim, near Waldheim. There were women. There are plenty of women
in Chicago.
I apologize, Bob. We have another one we want to hit. We're in the back here, and we've got 4 more minutes, Doctor.
All right, well, you can use one and I'll use the other 3.
You do that.
My chin. I'm wondering what your opinion is of what's going on with ICE and immigration today.
What's it?
No,
Yeah.
once you ask about your.
For that, and we need to cover lots of sides to that angle.
My opinion, you want my personal opinion?
Yes.
I think when I read newspapers, which means I read the New York Times and a few other papers, is there's a tremendous migration across the world, mainly from Africa, but Asia, of people who are poor, who are in war zones, trying to find a better life, and it's led to problems in Europe. It's led to problems in the United States. I would say offhand that unfettered immigration will be impossible to handle, but I would say that what I've seen is that immigrants are the lifeblood of this country, and I think I would imagine, I'm guessing, that the majority of people that I see in front of me are the descendants of immigrants, so a little bit of rachmanis, so it's a Yiddish word, a little bit of kindness. If it's good enough for us, it may be good enough for other people, but in a controlled way.
All right, I've got a couple.
Okay, I would say, one more, okay, yeah.
Couple of quick stories. One, there is a museum, relatively new one in New Orleans. It's called the Southern Jewish Experience.
Yeah.
So if you're ever in New Orleans, make it a point to catch it. It's really, really outstanding. It's very well put together.
Right.
And if you want to find out about the migration of Jewish people to the South, it's a great place to visit. The other thing was, when you mentioned Galveston, I moved to Dallas from here in 1977. My son was playing ice hockey in those days, and I signed him up for the Dallas Junior Hockey Association. I was talking with one of the fathers at a practice, and this guy was right off of 7th Avenue. His name was Morty Mendetition. And I said, what part of New York are you from? He said, I'm not from New York. I said, where are you from? He said, I'm from the Valley. I said, what Valley? He said, the Rio Grande Valley. I figured this guy's pulling my leg. About 2 months later, I worked in the film business in Dallas, and I ran a studio down there. And a couple of documentary producers came to our facility to see what we had. We were new in town and so forth. And how many of you remember that? You've seen their work on Channel 11 many times over the past 30 or 40 years. One of their first documentaries was called Who Remembers Mama? Yeah. Well, they were working on one, when they came in to visit me, they were working on one called West of Hester Street. I said, oh, tell me about it. Hester Street is New York. Well, what west of Hester Street, and the story that they were doing, they were talking about where there were so many of Jews who came in to Ellis Island, and Ellis Island couldn't handle all of it. they rerouted them down to the bottom of Texas, hence the Rio Grande Valley. So old Morty wasn't pulling my leg. He talked like that, even though he came from Texas. So it was very interesting in that, in rerouting them down to that area. So with that, I think I will officially say thank you for the presentation today. It was fabulous.
Well, let me end by saying thank you. It's been a great privilege for me to be here. Thank you, Arnie, from before. Thank you, Ron, and thank you, my wife. And as I said, I've got a few copies of the book. This is my commercial. If anyone would like to buy them, $20, which is really my price. The sale price on Amazon is twice as much, and I'll be sitting here. Thank you so much.